Berlin, 1933. A thin winter fog draped the capital like a shroud of cold gauze, muffling sounds and turning street lamps into pale halos. The Weimar Republic was collapsing under its own exhaustion, and Germany was searching for a new identity, any identity, strong enough to silence the humiliation of defeat. In that fragile moment, a young architect named Albert Speer, barely known outside academic circles, walked through the doors of a political rally that would redefine his life and, eventually, the fate of an entire continent. He was 28 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and eager to belong to something larger than himself. He did not yet know that he would become one of the most important men in Adolf Hitler's inner circle. Speer was not drawn by ideology. He was drawn by opportunity. Unlike the loud loyalists who worshipped the party dogma, he was quiet, almost aloof. A man who preferred drafting tables to political slogans. But when he first saw Hitler speak, something inside him shifted. Later, he would describe it as a technical admiration for the man's power of persuasion. But those who knew Speer understood the truth. He had found a patron with unlimited appetite, someone who could turn his grand architectural fantasies into stone and steel. In a crumbling republic, Hitler offered him something intoxicating, a blank canvas. Within months, Speer rose with improbable speed. He redesigned rally grounds, transformed decrepit ministries into monumental showcases, and caught Hitler's eye with his ability to translate ideology into architecture. Hitler, the failed artist who dreamed of reshaping Germany into a neoclassical empire rivaling Rome, saw in Speer the executor of his vision. And Speer, flattered by the attention of the most powerful man in Germany, stepped willingly into the role. He learned how to speak softly, how to anticipate Hitler's desires, how to be indispensable without appearing ambitious. In a regime defined by paranoia and rivalry, Speer became the exception, the golden son who was trusted implicitly. By 1934, his work on the Nuremberg rallies transformed him into the Reich's rising star. He illuminated the sky with 130 anti-aircraft searchlights arranged in a perfect circle, producing what foreign journalists called the Cathedral of Light. It was not merely spectacle, it was psychological architecture, a manipulation of space designed to make individuals feel small and the state feel eternal. For Hitler, this was genius. For Speer, it was a career-defining moment. For the world, it was the beginning of a new propaganda weapon built not from bullets, but from geometry and light. Success followed him like a shadow. His blueprints for Germania, the future capital of a victorious Reich, revealed a breathtaking and terrifying scale. A dome so large it could create its own weather, an avenue longer than the Champs-Élysées, colonnades stretching beyond the eye's reach. These were not buildings. They were declarations of supremacy, crafted by a man who understood that architecture could be used to reshape the human spirit. Speer never carried a rifle. His weapon was vision. Yet, behind the elegance of marble facades, another form of construction was taking shape. Speer became ministerial advisor, then chief architect, then confidant. He moved closer to Hitler than any other civilian. Hitler dined with him, walked with him, trusted him. Other ministers envied him, but Speer learned how to navigate the internal storms of the Nazi hierarchy with surgical precision. He stayed out of scandals, avoided political feuds, and cultivated an image of the apolitical professional, a facade that would later save his life. When war erupted in 1939, Speer's role expanded beyond architecture. Hitler saw him not just as a designer, but as a man capable of organizing chaos. As the regime mobilized, Speer became a quiet force of order, a technocrat who understood logistics, efficiency, and the language of production. The skills that once built stadiums would soon build something far darker. But in these early years, Speer convinced himself he was simply serving his country, not the machinery of genocide it was becoming. His self-delusion became his greatest armor. He spoke rarely in public, preferring the anonymity of drafting rooms and administrative offices. While Goebbels manipulated the masses and Göring flaunted his power, Speer cultivated a much more dangerous identity. The reasonable Nazi, the educated one, the man capable of making the regime seem almost civilized to outsiders. Diplomatic visitors found him calm, articulate, modern. A stark contrast to the brutal tone of the men around him. It was a performance of disarming normality, a mask he would wear for decades. But every ascent has a price. With each commission, with each personal invitation from Hitler, Speer's ties to the regime deepened. His architectural dreams flourished on land confiscated from Jews. His offices expanded in buildings emptied by political purges. His reputation grew in tandem with a system built on hate and violence. Yet he pressed forward, convinced that his work existed above politics, that he was merely shaping stone, not shaping the future of a dictatorship. It was a lie, he told himself with increasing conviction. By the early 1940s, Speer was no longer just an architect. He was becoming the architect of something far larger, a new Germany, rising through rallies, monuments, and disciplined labour. His talent had bought him access, power, and influence. It had also tethered his destiny to one of the darkest chapters in human history. And as Hitler's trust grew, the responsibilities given to Speer would soon pull him into the heart of a war machine more brutal than anything he ever imagined. Before continuing this journey into Speer's transformation from architect to armaments czar, a shift that would make him one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. Take a moment. If you want more forgotten stories like this, stories that reveal the hidden architects behind history's most destructive empires, consider supporting this channel with a like and subscription. It helps bring these complex narratives to light. But here's the question that lingers as we move forward. Did Speer truly believe architecture made him innocent? Or was he already crafting the lies he would later use to save himself? When war consumed Europe in 1939, Albert Speer was still known primarily as Hitler's architect, a young, cultured technocrat whose grand plans promised to reshape Germany into a monumental empire. But architecture was no longer enough for the Führer. Hitler needed something far more valuable than marble and columns, someone who could impose order on a chaotic, bloated wartime bureaucracy. And among the infighting, vanity, and corruption inside the Third Reich's leadership, Speer stood out as the only man who seemed capable of turning ideology into logistics and ambition into production. His moment arrived unexpectedly. In February 1942, the German armaments minister, Fritz Todt, died in a mysterious plane crash after repeatedly warning Hitler that the war could not be won. Within hours, with no consultation and no political debate, Hitler appointed Albert Speer as his successor. To everyone's shock, the 36-year-old architect, with no formal training in economics or industrial management, was suddenly responsible for feeding the entire German war machine. Guns, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, fuel, steel, manpower, all now depended on a man whose deepest experience had been drawing monumental facades. Speer embraced the challenge with cold efficiency. What he lacked in technical expertise, he compensated with organizational brilliance. He visited factories personally, listening to engineers and foremen rather than party officials. He dismantled layers of redundant committees, centralized decision-making, and replaced the chaotic rivalries of Nazi ministries with something resembling modern management. He demanded rationality in a regime built on disorder, numbers in a system driven by ideology, discipline in a government where loyalty mattered more than competence. The results were immediate and astonishing. Despite Allied bombings, shrinking resources, and the collapse of supply chains, Speer increased armaments production massively. Tanks doubled, aircraft tripled, and ammunition output soared. A country fighting on multiple fronts, losing territory and manpower, somehow produced more weapons in 1944 than in any previous year. Military experts worldwide still study this phenomenon as the Speer miracle, a term that disturbed even him later in life. For while he brought efficiency, it came at a horrific cost. Behind the clean charts and production reports lay a brutal reality. Speer's industrial empire relied on forced labour. Millions of prisoners, deportees, and concentration camp inmates worked under inhuman conditions to fuel Germany's war effort. Speer later claimed he was unaware of the worst atrocities, insisting he was too focused on production figures to see the suffering behind the numbers. But archival records tell a different story. He attended meetings where labour shortages were discussed openly, where the SS proposed solutions, and where human lives were translated into quotas and delivery schedules. Speer may not have visited the camps, but he knew what made his factories run, and he accepted it. His relationship with Hitler deepened as his success grew. The Führer admired Speer's discipline, his intelligence, and above all, his loyalty. Unlike the flamboyant Göring or the manipulative Goebbels, Speer provided a quiet stability. He did not challenge Hitler, but he did not flatter him either. He positioned himself as the dependable executor, the man who could transform the Führer's wishes into reality. Their bond became almost paternal. Hitler described Speer as the only man in his circle who truly understood him. Speer, for his part, enjoyed a level of influence almost unimaginable for a civilian in a totalitarian regime. But power inside the Reich was never without enemies. Göring despised him. Bormann distrusted him. Himmler envied him. They saw Speer as a threat, a technocrat who could eclipse them not through ideology, but through competence. Yet Speer navigated the internal minefield with calculated detachment. He avoided scandals, refused invitations to join conspiracies, and maintained an image of the rational engineer standing above political corruption. That image, carefully built and maintained, would become his shield after the war. As Germany's situation worsened, Speer's responsibilities expanded again. He was tasked with sustaining a war Germany could no longer realistically win. Raw materials collapsed. Factory workers died or fled. Cities burned under Allied bombs. But Speer reorganized production hubs, dispersed factories underground, and introduced assembly line techniques copied from the United States. His efficiency prolonged the war by months, possibly more, costing countless additional lives on all sides. Near the end, cracks began to appear in his relationship with Hitler. As the Führer increasingly retreated into delusion, Speer presented reports that contradicted the fantasy of imminent victory. He attempted, discreetly, to prevent Hitler's scorched earth order, which called for destroying German infrastructure to leave nothing to the Allies. Speer later portrayed this as an act of moral resistance. Some see it as self-preservation. Others see it as a final attempt to salvage Germany's future, so he could argue later that he had not been fully complicit in its destruction. The historical debate continues. By the spring of 1945, the empire Speer helped build was collapsing. Hitler retreated to his bunker. The factories he had reorganized were buried in rubble. The architectural dreams he once sketched were ashes scattered across a dying Reich. For the first time in his career, Speer faced the consequences of the system he had served so efficiently. And as Germany surrendered, he knew he would soon have to answer for the millions who suffered under the machinery he kept alive. Now, with the walls of the Reich crumbling around him, a new stage of his story was about to begin. One not of grand construction, but of courtroom strategy, moral ambiguity, and the reinvention of a man determined to rewrite his own legacy. And that leads to a single haunting question. Did Speer increase Germany's war production out of duty, or was he building the perfect alibi for the reckoning he knew was coming? By 1943, Albert Speer stood at the centre of an empire made of factories, steel, statistics, and fear. Germany was losing territory, bleeding manpower, and collapsing under the weight of a war it could no longer sustain. Yet somehow the Reich's armament output kept rising. Allied analysts who studied the numbers could not understand it. How could a nation under siege produce more planes, more tanks, more ammunition than ever before? The answer lay in the system Speer built, a system that fused engineering, coercion, and ruthless efficiency into a single industrial machine. In those years, Speer did not simply manage the war effort, he became the war effort. He approached production not ideologically, but mathematically. Every resource became a variable, every worker a unit of labour, every factory a node in a vast logistical web. He imposed standardised designs, eliminated bureaucratic rivalries, and forced competing ministries to work under a unified command. Steel allocations shifted weekly, and factories were reorganized to create continuous production lines. Even as bombers flattened entire cities, Speer dispersed critical industries underground, carving weapons plants into mountains, caves, tunnels, and abandoned mines. The result was a hidden landscape of war, thousands of kilometers of subterranean corridors, built not by engineers but by prisoners. It was here that the darker side of Speer's empire revealed its true face. His system required labour on a scale Germany could no longer supply. To meet production quotas, Speer turned to the only source the Reich had left: millions of forced labourers from occupied territories, concentration camps, and POW compounds. Men and women were dragged from their homes, transported in cattle cars, and assigned to factories that fed the German war machine. Many died before reaching their destination. Those who survived entered a world where exhaustion, disease, and brutality were routine. They built the tunnels. They assembled V2 rockets. They forged the steel that kept the war alive. Speer would later claim he never understood the extent of the suffering. He said he was too focused on production charts, too overwhelmed by administrative burdens, too distant from the SS to know the truth. But documents, testimonies, and minutes from meetings contradict him. He attended conferences where labour supply was discussed in euphemisms everyone understood. He signed orders requesting tens of thousands of new workers from Himmler's network of camps. He visited underground factories where starving prisoners moved like shadows through tunnels coated with dust. Even if he did not witness every atrocity, he benefited from the system that produced them, and strengthened it through his demands. Yet Speer convinced himself that he had no choice. He believed that if he refused to use forced labour, someone else would. Someone less competent, more ideological, more brutal. It was the same argument he had used since 1933, the argument that allowed him to imagine himself as a civilized man within a barbaric regime. He told himself he was protecting workers by improving their rations. He told himself he was limiting SS power by imposing industrial discipline. He told himself that his efficiency served Germany, not the dictatorship. This moral self-deception became the engine that allowed him to continue. But numbers do not lie. Under Speer's direction, the German armaments system consumed human lives at a scale almost impossible to comprehend. In the Mittelbau-Dora complex alone, more prisoners died producing V2 rockets than civilians in London died from those rockets. It is one of history's starkest equations. Speer's miracles of production were built on a foundation of death. He insisted later that he bore organisational responsibility, but not personal guilt. The survivors of his factories disagreed. Still, within Germany, Speer's reputation soared. Hitler praised him publicly and privately. Generals sought his assistance. Secretaries admired his calm demeanour. Foreign diplomats were perplexed by his intelligence and modernity. While other Nazi leaders appeared grotesque, corrupt, or fanatical, Speer embodied something far more unsettling: competence. He was the polished face of the regime, the man who could speak to experts without embarrassing himself, the man who gave the Reich an aura of technological sophistication. He did not shout, he did not threaten, he did not rant. He worked, and, in a dictatorship defined by chaos, that made him invaluable. By late 1944, as the Third Reich staggered toward collapse, Speer became one of the few officials still capable of coherent planning. He warned Hitler that the war was lost, urged him to preserve German infrastructure, and tried, quietly, to prevent the final destruction orders that would have plunged the nation into permanent ruin. He later described this as resistance. Some historians argue it was simply rationality. Others believe it was the first step in crafting the narrative he would use at Nuremberg, the myth of the apolitical technocrat, the man who served the regime, but did not share its crimes. As the front lines closed in, Speer's empire shrank into dust. Bombed factories, abandoned tunnels, broken railways. The very things he had built now collapsed in front of him. The war he helped prolong was ending, and the world he had shaped with such precision was dissolving into chaos. When the Allied armies crossed into Germany, they found the remnants of his system, mountains of documents, empty factories, fields of mass graves, and tunnels lined with machinery still covered in the fingerprints of forced labourers. For Speer, the reckoning was near. He understood something the other Nazi leaders did not. Survival depended not on denying everything, but on crafting a new identity before it was too late. The architect of the Reich was about to become the architect of his own salvation. As we move toward the courtroom battles that would define his legacy, there is a question history still struggles to answer. Did Speer try to save Germany in 1945, or did he try to save himself? When the war finally ended in May 1945, Albert Speer walked through the ruins of Germany with a calmness that puzzled the Allied officers who took him into custody. Berlin had collapsed into a skeletal wasteland of shattered concrete and twisted steel. The grand boulevards he once dreamed of carving into the capital were now trenches of rubble. The factories he had organised with such precision stood silent, their assembly lines frozen mid-motion. Hitler was gone, the Reich was gone, and everything Speer had built, or helped sustain, had dissolved in flames. Yet he understood something crucial. While the regime had died, the narrative of its survivors had not yet been written, and Speer was determined to write his own. Unlike Goering, who arrived at Nuremberg defiant and eager to reclaim his lost power, Speer entered the tribunal with an air of introspective dignity. He did not insult the judges, did not plead ignorance, did not wrap himself in the tattered remains of Nazi ideology. He positioned himself as something entirely new, the repentant technocrat, the rational man trapped in an irrational system, the intellectual who had made terrible mistakes but retained a conscience. In a courtroom filled with denial, rage, and delusion, Speer's attitude was disarming. The prosecution expected him to resist. Instead, he admitted a degree of responsibility for the system he served. He acknowledged the use of forced labour. He described his proximity to Hitler. He confessed that he had failed morally. These admissions, carefully measured, strategically delivered, stunned observers. While other defendants attacked the legitimacy of the tribunal, Speer agreed with it. While others tried to rewrite history, Speer presented himself as a man finally willing to confront it. The judges, journalists, and even some prosecutors saw him as the exception, the Nazi who understood guilt. But Speer's remorse was selective. He constructed a narrative in which he was a loyal administrator, but never an ideologue, a man who improved working conditions, but never sanctioned brutality, an architect who became minister out of duty rather than ambition. He insisted he had no knowledge of the final solution, no involvement in extermination camps, no role in planning genocide. He emphasized his conflicts with the SS, his late attempts to prevent further destruction, his supposed resistance to Hitler's final orders. Bit by bit, he carved out a space for himself that was neither villain nor victim, but something in between. Historians later discovered the omissions in his story. Speer had attended meetings where mass deportations were discussed. He had overseen programs that depended on slave labour from concentration camps. He had received letters, reports, and memos that contradicted his claims of ignorance. He had authorized expansions of underground facilities where prisoners died by the thousands. But at Nuremberg, none of this was fully proven, and Speer skillfully framed every accusation in terms of administrative distance, bureaucratic complexity, or personal oversight. It was a performance that blended honesty with evasion, confession with misdirection. The tribunal faced a dilemma. Speer's intelligence and composure contrasted sharply with the other defendants. He appeared modern, articulate, even humane. Yet he had wielded enormous power. Arguably, more than many of the men who shouted their innocence. Some judges believed his remorse was genuine, that he represented a rare moment of moral reflection. Others suspected he was simply the most sophisticated liar among them. Ultimately, the court delivered a verdict that reflected this ambiguity. 20 years in prison, neither absolved nor condemned to death. Spandau prison became Speer's new world. Within its walls, he began crafting the second phase of his legacy. He wrote thousands of pages of reflections, diaries, and memoirs. He portrayed himself as a man horrified by what the regime had done, a man who bore responsibility but not the specific guilt of ideological crimes. His writings were introspective, elegant, and often persuasive. Journalists and intellectuals praised his honesty. Western readers saw him as the good Nazi, the one who admitted guilt when others hid behind excuses. For decades, his story shaped public understanding of the regime's internal dynamics. But the myth had cracks. Former forced labourers accused him directly. Historians uncovered documents contradicting his claims. Survivors of Mittelbau-Dora described conditions so brutal that no senior minister could plausibly claim ignorance. In interviews late in life, Speer remained evasive, repeating formulas of guilt without detailing the acts behind them. "I should have known," he often said, a phrase that acknowledged responsibility without admitting intent. Yet, this ambiguity was precisely what preserved his reputation. Unlike Hitler's other lieutenants, Speer did not become a symbol of fanaticism. He became a symbol of moral complexity. A reminder that evil is not only the domain of monsters, but also of intelligent, educated men who convince themselves they are merely doing their jobs. His greatest talent, many now believe, was not architecture or industrial management, but the construction of a persona so carefully designed that even decades after his death, scholars still debate where remorse ends and manipulation begins. Speer walked out of Spandau in 1966, a free man at 61. He found a world eager to hear his story, eager to believe that some fragment of the Third Reich had been redeemed through introspection. He lived quietly, gave interviews, wrote books, and maintained the image he crafted at Nuremberg. Thoughtful, reflective, burdened by guilt, but never quite guilty enough. He died in 1981, still holding the contradictions he spent a lifetime shaping. His legacy remains one of the most divisive of the 20th century, a man who built monuments to dictatorship, engineered the extension of a catastrophic war, relied on slavery to fuel his factories, and then convinced much of the world that he had been its reluctant participant rather than its architect. So, as we prepare to explore the final chapter of his life and the broader implications of his legacy, one question towers over all the others. Was Albert Speer truly repentant, or did he build the greatest deception of his career at Nuremberg? Albert Speer spent the last years of his life navigating a paradox of his own creation. For decades, he lived not as a fugitive or a pariah, but as a public figure, interviewed, analysed, invited to speak. He moved through the world as a man who had confronted his past, a man who carried the weight of guilt with a strange elegance. To many, he was the Nazi who had broken the pattern, the one who admitted responsibility while the others hid behind defiance. Yet beneath the polished surface of that persona lay a deeper question. What does it mean for a man to be both guilty and believable, both remorseful and evasive, both insider and outsider to the darkest crimes of the 20th century? After his release from Spandau in 1966, Speer re-entered society as if emerging from a long exile. He settled in Heidelberg, wrote books that became international bestsellers, and cultivated the image of a reflective intellectual who had survived a nightmare. His memoir, Inside the Third Reich, captivated readers with its unique perspective, an intimate, almost clinical account of Hitler's inner circle. For a generation seeking to understand how a modern, educated nation could collapse into barbarism, Speer provided an answer that felt reassuring. that evil could happen not only through fanaticism, but through the quiet obedience of technocrats. He became, in a sense, the interpreter of a catastrophe he had helped create. But the more he spoke, the more visible the inconsistencies became. His descriptions of Hitler were vivid, yet strangely sanitized. His explanations of labour policies sounded remorseful, yet stripped of specifics. His insistence that he knew nothing of the final solution rested on a thin foundation of selective memory. Historians began to peel back the layers of his narrative, uncovering documents he had minimized, testimonies he had ignored, and actions he had reframed as misunderstandings. What emerged was a portrait not of a man seeking truth, but of a man mastering the art of partial confession. The world, however, was eager to believe him. In Speer, many found a moral refuge, a melodboltetem, a Northarbernam, a way to imagine that not all who served the Reich were driven by hatred. He represented a version of totalitarianism that felt more familiar, more human, more unsettling. The bureaucrat who follows orders, the professional who prioritizes efficiency over ethics, the expert who convinces himself that technical skill absolves moral responsibility. Speer became the symbol of a modern danger, the danger of the intelligent collaborator, yet his influence extended beyond historical interpretation. Architects studied his plans for Germania with a mixture of fascination and horror. Engineers examined his wartime production strategies, acknowledging their efficiency while confronting their human cost. Psychologists analysed his interviews for signs of genuine remorse versus manipulative self-awareness. In every field that touched his work, Speer became a case. Study in ethical failure disguised as competence. His personal life reflected the same contradictions. He maintained friendships, enjoyed travel, and presented himself as a man living under the shadow of past mistakes. He spoke often of guilt, but rarely of specifics. He acknowledged the suffering of forced labourers, but avoided naming the systems he oversaw. He admitted that he had failed morally, but rejected the idea that he had known the true scale of Nazi crimes. His remorse became a performance polished over decades, convincing enough to soften public opinion, yet vague enough to protect the myth he had built. When Speer died of a stroke in London in 1981, the newspapers wrote obituaries that reflected his duality. Some called him Hitler's architect, a brilliant technician who lost his way in the service of tyranny. Others called him the good Nazi, a term that revealed more about society's need for comforting narratives than about Speer himself. A few called him what historians increasingly believed he was, the most successful manipulator to emerge from Nuremberg. His legacy today is more contested than ever. For some, he remains a symbol of how ordinary ambition can become extraordinary cruelty when it aligns with power. For others, he represents the moral ambiguity of individuals who operate within authoritarian systems, the grey zone where responsibility is shared, diluted, and sometimes strategically forgotten. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, that intelligence can be weaponized, that talent can serve evil as easily as it serves good, and that remorse can be crafted as meticulously as architecture. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of his legacy is the illusion he built, an illusion so meticulously constructed that it survived him. Speer taught the world a lesson it did not expect, that the most dangerous figures in a dictatorship are not always the loudest, nor the most fanatical, but sometimes the most capable, the most organized, the most ordinary. He showed that totalitarian systems do not rely solely on zealots. They rely on professionals who convince themselves that their contribution is neutral, even noble. In the end, Albert Speer remains a mirror held up to the 20th century, reflecting not only the crimes of a regime, but the weaknesses of a civilization eager to accept easy explanations. He was not simply an architect of buildings or an architect of war. He was an architect of his own myth, constructing a legacy as carefully as he once designed monuments for the Reich. And long after his death, that myth continues to shape our understanding of guilt, responsibility, and the seductive power of self-deception. So, as we step back from his life and examine the totality of his story, one question refuses to fade. Did Albert Speer's legacy survive because he was genuinely remorseful, or because the world needed to believe that someone like him could be redeemed?